Adesso chiudi gli occhi e immagina un futuro senza fame, senza guerre, senza povertà, un futuro senza discriminazioni, dove il clima non cambia, dove essere donna non fa paura. È il momento di aprire gli occhi. Impegnandoci tutti raggiungeremo ogni obiettivo. Se possiamo immaginarlo, possiamo farlo. Uno sviluppo sostenibile è possibile. Vieni a vederlo con i tuoi occhi. Festival dello Sviluppo Sostenibile. Guardiamo al futuro.
Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, benvenute e benvenuti a questo appuntamento del Festival dello Sviluppo Sostenibile, l'8ª edizione in corso di svolgimento in tutta Italia. Siamo partiti il 7 maggio, concluderemo il 23 maggio e avremo più di 1000 eventi su tutto il territorio nazionale. Oggi parliamo di una questione decisiva per il nostro futuro, e cioè come possiamo finanziare, e in particolare a livello europeo, come possiamo spingere la transizione ecologica, le altre transizioni, verso un futuro sostenibile.
And other transitions towards a sustainable future. Last night, you have just seen a commercial, and this was broadcast by Blob, a TV program, particularly when it says open your eyes, and then they showed the parade on the Red Square in Russia. So some could say that is the world. So why do you keep talking about these issues? Sergio Mattarella, Italian president, in the last couple of days told at the UN Assembly that the 2030 agenda is not about bureaucracy or dreamers. It is very real. Together with ECHO, a major Italian think tank that is part of a European network, we are going to discuss about the future and how to build it. The floor to Luca Bergamaschi. Thank you, Enrico. It's a pleasure to be here at the 8th edition of ASBIS Festival. This is a critical time. 7 years until 2030 to achieve SDGs. 2024 is a topical year because what is happening now this year will have major ramifications. The European elections, the G7 summit hosted by Italy, the American elections in November. So these events are critical to set policies and establish investment for the second part, the second half of this decade. We have major guests with us to have a look into the future, and we are very happy to be here today, organized by ASBIS. Thank you, Enrico. Thank you all. The festival and ASBIS events can be found on the homepage of several information media agencies and newspapers, ANSA and Rai News in particular. So let's dive into the topic for today. Paolo Gentiloni, European Commissioner for Economic Affairs, is our first guest. Many thanks. Thanks to ASBIS. May I thank Enrico Giovannini. He has a great merit. In the last 7 or 8 years, ASBIS focused on the development, sustainable development agenda. In a few weeks, the European elections will take place. Italy and other countries have different agendas. We are not focusing on these topics, the topics we will discuss today, but we have to work to change things because this is important for our future. So it should be discussed by us. Professor Buti, a couple of months ago, promoted a manifesto for Europe. These are paramount. These topics are paramount. I will simply make a couple of comments on the state of the art, the state of play of climate transition. So some SDGs in particular, the European Commission will soon end its term, but so far has focused pretty much on this. At the end of 19, beginning of 2020, this was kind of the identity card of the von der Leyen Commission. The great choice for the Commission to characterize the new European Commission. As you know, many things happened. The COVID pandemic, and then in February 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war in particular at the borders of the Union is heavily affecting our agenda, including Sustainable Development Agenda. SDGs, and this SDG in particular, have been discussed by the Commission. Enrico too has tried to link together sustainable development and economic development. At the UN, a proposal was submitted to illustrate European programs for sustainable development. We delivered a presentation at the UN Assembly a couple of months ago. The environment, however, has been for us very, very important. So I think it is more than helpful to recall what we have done. 3 or 4 days ago, we Copernicus figures were published between April 23 and March 2024. During this period of time, the temperature increased by 1.58 degrees. This is alarming. This has been discussed online more than by other media. It's an alarming signal. It doesn't mean that we have lost the game, including the goals set with the Paris Agreement, because the world is acting, is moving. I'm proud to say that the European Union has been paving the way to this, towards this goal. So goals are achievable, can be achieved, but it takes a remarkable effort. At European level, the emission level last year, by the way, quote unquote, Enrico is an expert in statistics. We're also working with Eurostat to provide figures more frequently, and environmental issues, because the problem is that unless you measure these phenomena, how can they be discussed by the political agenda? Relative to other macroeconomic parameters, we should measure emission levels more often. Anyway, those measurements tell us that 2023 on 2022 recorded an emission decline by 2.25%. Solar capacity installed across the Union last year amounted to 56 gigawatts. You know what this means. It's like 56 nuclear power plants. So it's a major result. Steps forward, are they economically supported? Yes. We often wonder about investment, the size of investment, our fiscal rules. We do so together with other actors of the global economy. The debate on the Special Reduction Act in the States. Sometimes we underestimate what has been done in recent years. Net generation was also due to the Eurobonds, but anyway, this has allowed to distribute public aid across Europe, especially for two transitions. There are also quantity thresholds, environmental transition and digital transition. So steps forward with renewables and emission cuts are also due to public resources, thanks to Next Generation. Are these resources sufficient?
efficaci nel fare, in particolare la direzione
the ECFIN DG of the European Commission specifies how many more billions are needed between now and 2030. And it turns out it takes 620 billion every year between now and 2030. So what do? Are you scared in the face of such figures? I don't think we should be scared. Most of such additional resources will come from private capital. Global finance is pushing towards environmental or social investment. The so-called capital market union, the way capital markets work, how we can strengthen them. Well, this is a hot topic. And of course, there is a contradiction between words and actual steps forward. Anyway, it is at the core of governments and European institutions. Likewise, the most important contribution to this financial investment effort will and shall come from private funds and investments. Are they sufficient? Well, between now and 2026, we can make it.
Siamo un po' in questa contraddizione nel dibattito europeo e forse soprattutto italiano. Da una parte si dice ma le regole.
Some say, you know, economic budget rules don't leave much leeway to investment. At the same time, we cannot use available resources. We cannot use those resources within the established deadlines. Oftentimes we ask for extensions. We are late in using European resources. So quite often what lacks in public accounts is not space for investment. What lacks is resources for current expenditure. But anyway, I don't want to bore you with this subject. One point is especially important. Yes, we have Next Generation EU. We have a huge contribution coming from private investors. There are programs to put together public funds and private investments. The Deputy President of the European Bank for Investment is here with us today. We work with them on Invest EU, one example showing how to put public and private subjects together. This, however, doesn't mean we can give up the obvious need to deploy in a short time, starting from next year, new instruments, new European tools and instruments to fund the common European goals, or else we will take part in the global competition for climate transition and clean technologies in unfair conditions, very different from other major players. And I believe that as it was decided when the European Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen was appointed, we want to keep our global leadership in the field of climate transition. Goals, timelines, laws, regulations are huge. The package of decisions made by European institutions in the last 2 or 3 years on environmental transition topics is gigantic. So this shall be accompanied, shall be somehow assisted in some European regions. Some European regions will suffer from the transition. They will need support. The Commission has made decisions that may also be wrong. Some deadlines, goals, objectives may have to be revised. But in the face of skepticism in some countries, excessive rigidity should be fixed. Difficulties in a number of sectors should be understood and supported. I mean, this transition should be socially just. At the same time, the European leadership should be maintained it would be a grave mistake not being global leaders in this field. So there are things we have to do to make this transition credible. The European Union, at the end of the day, is responsible only for 8% of global emissions. So some could say, let's wait for others to act. Why should we be the first? It would be very, very wrong. Well, first of all, we would harm the planet. Many global players have decided to follow the example set by Union. So we are leaders not only because of the 8% emission rate, and this is also to do with the competitiveness of our economy, how firms and companies will position themselves during these global transitions in the upcoming decades. Are we going to be competitive enough? So there is an implicit cost in not doing things, in not leading this path. This is a direction, this is a path that we must take. It's going to be beneficial for our societies, for citizens, the way we eat, move, live. Giving up the European leadership would amount to have a poorer European Union. But why? Why should this happen? We are at the lead. We simply have to handle and manage difficulties. Difficulties do exist. I don't deny them. Just look at how people react in some sectors, in some regions. So you can't close your eyes in the face of such difficulties, but to implement this transition successfully, we have to face and address those difficulties. This is what we did during the pandemic. We were quite brave, and so I believe that the next European Commission and Parliament shall preserve this horizon as one of their top priorities. This is not the time to go back. We have to go ahead, forward. Thank you.
I really thank Paolo Gentiloni for his words and for the clarity of his contribution and his right approach to our outlooks, to our perspectives. We will have some brief presentations that will help us to demonstrate the reason why today's debate is so important and why the related investment is so important. On Tuesday, ASBES presented its spring report on these topics. We recalled that Italy is not on a sustainable development path. Not even Europe is on a path of sustainable development based on data from Oxford Economics. which is an international consultancy. We shaped a number of scenarios, a basic scenario with an increase in average temperature of 1.9 degrees by 2050. Europe, in Europe, the increase in temperature is above average, and in Italy, it is even higher. Then we envisage the net zero by 2050 scenario. And then we also analyzed another scenario, that is to say, using climate transition to generate a net zero transformation. Then we tried to assess what Paolo Gentiloni indicated as a waiting attitude. So in this case, we have a scenario of late transition, as done by the declaration of the G7 ministers some days ago. And then we have the climate catastrophe, the global climate catastrophe. By 2050, we will have an increase in temperature of 2.3 centigrade degrees. However, these scenarios, these simulations do not consider the damage arising from extreme weather events. Since 2019, the cost of these events is equal to 13 billion euro. I would like to stress one asymmetric factor, that is to say that the restoration of damage deriving from climate is not connected with taxation, whereas prevention is connected with taxation. So this is a strange wording of the Stability Pact. And perhaps it places emphasis on investments, avoiding the damage resulting from weather events, from extreme weather events. In these scenarios, we also introduced a distribution, division between private investments and public investments. In the net zero transformation, that is with a quantum leap in climate transition, we need more investment, but we also need the switch between public investment and private investment at a later stage. What is absolutely necessary is the introduction of a carbon tax to allow the capitalist system to work well, but the later we introduce the carbon tax, the higher this carbon tax should be. And we analyze the steps that are to be taken from a negative scenario to a positive scenario. The role of investments is crucial. On this scenario, net zero transformation might actually lead to a reduction of GDP and employment in the initial stage of transition. However, with innovation and with massive investments, this result may turn into a positive result. And this makes the difference in terms of global CO2 emissions with respect to the global climate catastrophe scenario, which is not purely theoretical. I would like to emphasize that in these simulations, GDP reaches zero at the end of the period, 75 years. Obviously, with a very high temperature, society could not could not work. So in economic terms, this would be a disaster. In Italy, as you can see, the difference is due to investments. In these simulations, we demonstrate that both the basic scenario and late transition require investments. This will change the energy mix in the net zero, on the net zero scenario. There is some part of GHGs that are due to the emissions of fossil fuels, but these emissions are offset. We started from the Inflation Reduction Act of the United States, and we based some assumptions on this package. But the theme of inflation is real, is actual, because if I introduce a carbon tax and if I encourage investments, one piece of additional inflation should be added to the scenario. Therefore, we have this purely economic simulation producing a reduction of GDP, which would be limited for Italy, but which is necessary, that we should turn into positive. Actually, in these simulations, if we take our simulation and if we introduce full range innovation, that is a global innovation, then it will be advantageous. And by 2030, we would have a 1% increase in GDP, unemployment declines, and then with the passing of years, this gain will increase until reaching 2 percentage points by 2050, provided that innovation is broad range innovation, so innovation in all areas, in all sectors, the operation of markets, for example, the operation of financial markets in Europe. The Capital Markets Union has many difficulties in making progress, but all this would have a positive impact on the reduction between debt and GDP. In the case of the simple net zero scenario, this reduction would be equal to 6 percentage points, reaching 16 percentage points. And this is a crucial point with respect to new taxation rules, and Professor Butti and others will apologize us, because the new version of the document coming out of the European Council and of the debate with the European Commission, I think many Italians read only the first version without relying on subsequent versions of the documents. And so the updated documents introduce some measures to avoid adverse effects. I would conclude this presentation by saying that we are trying to shift the political debate from the short to the long term, from a sectoral approach to a systemic approach, to ex post complaints, to ex ante planning. And I would conclude with this sentence. Sometimes utopia is a very convenient word to use, but sometimes it becomes a dream towards which we should aim. So we started our festival with an event at Ivrea, because Olivetti, the company Olivetti, decided to keep writing machines and to continue. And we hope that European policies will not be short-sighted in order to avoid mistakes.
Mille grazie.
Thank you, Enrico. I will try to be very brief. We have two interesting panels. I'll go to one of the key points of the discussion paper, what Paolo Gentiloni was asking, what will happen after 2026, what will happen, how will we cope with investment requirements. So with the European Sovereign Fund for the Climate Transition, we wondered whether we could have a legal and technical instrument to introduce joint borrowing, that is the common capability of gathering capital and distributing this capital among European countries. So based on the experience of the Next Generation EU, we wondered whether a similar instrument could be postponed to the period after 2026. So an instrument based on public investment in addition to private investments. So we hope that a similar experience will provide up to 20% of public investment needs. This solution would not need a change in the current treaties, and above all, it is part of a reference framework that should not overlook, especially at a time of European elections. Countries from the G7 are moving at a very fast pace. The pace is faster than the one of Europe. Let's recall the US package, the investments envisaged in China. The United Kingdom has also an appropriate package. Japan introduced a green investment funds. So the G7 countries are moving towards that direction. What about Europe? Europe will introduce new instruments based on instruments that have been successful so far. Can a climate and energy instrument be efficient for the post 2026 period? I think that we should create a Western stronghold, a Western fortress. What are we envisaging for development? How can we restore the trust in Europe? What is the supply of Europe in terms of plans for development and prosperity for all? If we take the African context, in which many countries have difficulties in obtaining liquidity for investment, if we think of countries wishing to achieve a sustainable development? What are the investments to be done? What are the rules to be introduced by the multilateral development banks? And so these are questions to be answered by the Italian presidency of the G7, and also we will have to discuss the topics concerning the increase in debt, how to repay debts, how to create investments for growth, and how to create debt sustainability for the future. So during the first panel, we will have a European perspective, whereas the second panel has a more international perspective. We have speakers, we will have topics concerning Africa and Latin America, and we will discuss the role to be taken on by Europe, UN data. We know that the figures concerning debt, 7 billion, are very high all over the world. Now I would like to invite here to the floor for the panel, David Panzeri and the other speakers.
Please have a seat on the chair, on the benches. Yeah. Maybe avoid this. Not here. Not here. Yeah.
Sorry.
È nell'ombra, quel posto lì. Quindi mettiti. Grazie. Thank you very much. This looks precarious, but I'll try not to fall. And we'll switch to English now. Welcome everyone to the first panel on the case for increasing investment in Europe. My name is Davide Panzeri, and I'm the lead for the Europe program in ECHO, the climate change think tank. And I'm joined today on stage by a number of very distinguished guests. We have Mr. Frank Elderson here today on my right, who's the member of the Executive Board and Vice President of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank. We have Gelsomina Vigliotti, who's the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and Professor Marco Buti, holder of the Padua-Schioppa Chair in Economic and Monetary Integration at the European University Institute, and of course, former Chief of Staff of Commissioner Gentiloni, whom we've heard earlier. So welcome and thanks for being with us today. The theme is the case for increasing the investment in Europe. We heard from the previous panelists on the importance of financing the transition, not just from a climate change fighting point of view, but also from an economic and economic system point of view. The costs are significant. The work that Luca Bergamaschi quoted earlier, we estimate, but the estimations out there are plenty, around 3 to 4% of GDP in Europe, of which 1.5% possibly from public finance. We know that the Commission estimates a need for an additional 620 billion per year of investment. So there is a lot of money that needs to be found and has an impact on competitiveness and on the future, the economic future and competitiveness towards the rest of the world. So we'll look, we've got guests that will speak to the public side and to the private side of the financing. Maybe let me start with the first round of reactions to the theme today. We'll start with Mr. Frank Elderson here from the ECB.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here on a very distinguished panel. And compliments also for what I think is an excellent event. So the European Central Bank is responsible for monetary policy and for banking supervision in the euro area. And let me maybe first start by saying what we are not. So like any central bank and supervisor, the ECB is not and does not intend to be a climate and nature policy maker. Instead, we are climate and policy takers. Central banks and supervisors must take climate and nature-related factors into account in the pursuit of their mandate of preserving price stability and sound banks. And in fact, if central banks and supervisors were not to do so, they risk failing on their mandate, under-delivering on their mandate. Now, later in this conversation, I'm happy to share some more specifics on what the ECB are doing across our different tasks and responsibilities in this respect. And the point that I would like to make in this introduction is more general and twofold. First, analysis shows consistently that our mandate, price stability and sound banks, benefits tremendously from a timely and orderly transition, especially when assessed against the alternative scenarios of doing nothing or doing too little too late. So, in a nutshell, there is a lot of stake for central banks and supervisors in terms of the climate and nature policy makers being successful in delivering on their commitments, pursuing the objectives of the Paris Agreement. However, and this is my second point, in spite of the important progress made by the still incumbent European executive and legislative branches in terms of new legislation, new regulation, policies, the flow of finance continues to fall short relative to what is necessary to deliver a timely and orderly transition. And this is even more concerning when one acknowledges the assessment of climate science that at the moment we are not at a 1.5 degrees, nor a 2 degrees path, but we are rather on a 2.9 degrees path of global heating. And this trajectory assumes that governments deliver on all their existing commitments. So the gap to be bridged remains enormous. Let me identify a number of the bottlenecks that we observe in financial markets that urgently need to be resolved in this respect. First, capital markets are not playing their potential role in supporting the green transition. ECB research shows that stock markets can strongly encourage investment in greener technologies. However, those markets are still relatively underdeveloped in the EU, and cross-border flows are limited by a lack of harmonization. Resolving these issues and advancing the Capital Markets Union, it was referred to already earlier, as proposed by the European Commission, will make the flow of finance in Europe more efficient and at the same time more resilient. It will also satisfy investor demand for green assets. Research consistently points to the existence of a greenium in financial markets. In other words, a premium in terms of return on assets that investors are willing to forego on assets certified as green. Now, while most of the financing for the green transition should come from private resources, the public sector also has an important role to play, both directly through public investments and indirectly through co-financing, private-public partnerships, and state guarantees. Much of this will be financed through EU member states' national recovery and resilience plans as part of the Next Generation EU program that was set up to support the recovery from the pandemic. However, how much this EU-financed expenditure will contribute to the EU's climate objectives is uncertain and depends on how quickly and how successfully the individual countries implement their recovery and resilience plans. Some concerns related to administrative hurdles at the national level and local levels have emerged in the context of member states' capacity to implement these plans in time. Besides financing gaps that curtail the transition, there are also gaps in the financial system that are threatening its resilience to increased climate-related and environmental damages. A discussion paper by the ECB and the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, EIOPA, published a year ago, shows that only about 25% of all climate-related catastrophe losses in the EU are currently insured. And the lack of climate catastrophe insurance can affect the economy and financial stability. If losses are not covered by insurance, households and firms will take more time to resume their activities, slowing economic activity. And this would increase overall risks to the financial system. And what's more, the fiscal position of governments may also be weakened if they need to provide relief to cover uninsured losses. And these effects are particularly pertinent in light of the prevailing view of climate science that we are on a 2.9-degree trajectory. Taking climate science seriously, therefore, requires that resilience to more disastrous climate and nature outcomes that are the consequences of failing to meet the Paris Agreement goals should feature prominently in any decisions related to mitigation investment that are being taken already today. Finally, when we take a closer look at how the banks we supervise are faring in their journey, gaps are also being observed. On the one hand, the banks have made significant progress in starting to account for climate and nature-related risks. Most banks have now actually done a careful assessment of the relevance of climate and nature-related risks for their operation that we as a supervisor expect them to do. This is a fundamental step, as such assessments are a crucial precondition for banks to be able to manage any kind of risk. Now, on the other hand, it is only the first step, and a great deal more work lies ahead for the banks. And 24 is a crucial year for the banks to make decisive progress in truly becoming resilient to climate and nature-related risks. So to conclude, urgent and vitally important work continues to lie ahead for all, including legislators, regulators, supervisors, and policy makers, as well as policy takers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Elderson, and thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for reminding us of the importance of the risk that the climate change poses to the financial institutions, but also of the importance of a timely and orderly transition, and how not just the fact that there is a transition, but how happens and how well it's supported, financed, and targeted has an impact on costs as well. So thanks for that. Next, I would like to turn to Vice President Vigliotti of the European Investment Bank. Please.
Actually, the name of the bank means that our mission is devoted to promote investment, and the EIB was founded 58 together with the Treaty of Rome, together with other European institutions, with the mandate to promote investment in order to create is a real and true internal market, and to increase to decrease the level of divergences between the different parts of the European Union. And we are actually called to, to deliver the results that we have been mandated. And over the years, we have even more focused our activities on climate. And on 2019, we were the first multilateral bank to decide not to finance any more carbon fuels, carbon fossils energy, and to have a very specific target. Actually, we set as a target, together with our board of directors, which are the representative of the 27 member states of the European Union. Our target is that by 2025, the 50% of our activities are climate-oriented, and by 2030 to mobilize 1 trillion euro of climate-related activities. We are very well on track on this objective, and actually the 50% we reached already last year, and we also overcome this objective, and very well on track also for the objective of 2030. And I would like to underline the issue of catalyze investment. Actually, we never finance investment 100%. We generally finance a project by 50%, sometimes 75%, especially if there is an important climate-related content there. But our main objective is to catalyze private investment or investment by the public sector, by local sectors, by financial intermediaries. And our objective is that to put a sort of stamp of quality on the project, since we accompany our funding also with a very technical analysis. We have is a very important project department which support the promoters also in the final design of the project. And the consequence of the aggression of Russia in Ukraine has been sort of, challenge to us, because, we all remember what the time, what was the debate now to ensure that in Europe there was enough energy to support the economies and to provide energy to the families. And but we stayed on our commitment, since we realized that fostering and giving much more impulse to the renewable energy was our commitment. And in the end, this was accompanied by the REPowerEU project by the European Union, which actually has 3 major drivers. The first one is to push for the increase of production of renewable energy. The second one to increase energy efficiency. And the third one to sustain research and development within the technologies and the sciences, so that this process could have been accelerated. And in the end, we realized after a few years that overall the production of renewable has increased, the cost of renewables has decreased, and that a lot of efforts we are putting in providing energy efficiency. And there are estimates that prove how relevant it is to work on the efficiency. And right now we are working exactly on developing some financial instruments which could make easier the financing for energy efficiency, especially for the small and medium enterprises. The small and medium enterprises are one of our major clients, to which we have a great attention. And maybe they are the more constrained, and sometimes we receive complaints by them or by the financial intermediaries through which we operate with the small and medium enterprises. And the idea is to develop some standard products which could be developed at the scale and support this very important sector here in Europe. And on research and technology, also there have been major breakthrough innovation. If we look at what financed in Europe and outside of the European Union, it's amazing, starting from the gigafactory of Northvolt in Sweden to the Enel project in Sicily for the gigafactories, and thinking, for instance, to the wind farm package, which was just announced by the Commission, and where what is the role of the financial institutions? Finance has an important role to play because actually there is need of developing new financial instruments to support these sectors. For instance, in the wind power sector, we realized that what is necessary within the European financing system is not necessarily just funding, but obviously we have financial regulation, banking regulation that limit the exposure. And there are some sectors, like for instance the wind power sector, which is very concentrated, towards which banks are already very much concentrated. So what we proposed to all the financial sector is that to provide counter guarantee to the banks so that their capacity to finance this new type of project could be widened. So actually we are working through several type of instruments that could foster, the more production of renewable, more energy efficiency, and also to support technology. One point which was raised very importantly by the previous speaker, it's about, it's the role of the capital market. Actually, in Europe, we know that we have a very bank-centric system that, to finance and to fund investment, we rely very much on banking finance, while there is a huge opportunity for the capital markets to provide finance to the real economy. This is something that we see very importantly in other markets, like for instance in the US. And we are working through the bank, through the European Investment Bank, and through our fund, the European Investment Fund, to support and to provide finance to venture capital fund, to private equity funds, but also to accompany the very little startup which want to develop it's a breakthrough ideas and breakthrough initiative which could be put at scale and provide what is necessary. And we have these different instruments, starting from the venture debt, through which we provide funding on a very long term to be repaid according to the business profile of the enterprise, through the investment by the venture capital and the private equity. And I do not want to be too long in this first phase, but just to remember another important aspect, that in Europe there is a lot of creativity. There are a lot of, flourishing of startup, also in the green tech, in the clean tech. But what is relevant is that the lack of large-scale funding, especially coming from the capital markets. And what we have seen is that many of these relevant startups, they reach a stage for which, when they are ready to enter into the market, in the stock market, they become, they will be acquired by other big funds coming from, for instance, from the US or from Asia. So what we have put together with some larger European countries is an initiative so that to have the capacity to fund large funds here in Europe that can provide the finance at scale, which can ensure that the European champions remain here in Europe. Just a final word where I would like to have the opportunity to come later. It's about, what is also the role of the supervision, and what is the role that supervisors can put on the financial intermediaries. There is a huge debate now on if this is a constraint or this is an opportunity. So also this type of process, I think that has to be very well calibrated, and also that needs support. For instance, we have developed an instrument through which we support especially the small banks to assess the green content of the project that they finance. So I think that in the end, When we have talked about climate financing, I think that we have also to change the narrative and maybe to put that in a positive narrative, and also the public institutions like the bank, like the European Union, like central bank should also provide the instruments which can facilitate all the stakeholders to enter and accompany this process. Sorry to have been long.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vice President Vigliotti, and lots of interesting themes. I like that are already emerging, one of them, the capital market, but I also like the final message on the importance of changing the narrative. I think that resonates, and I think that can be one of the themes going forward. Last, but by no means least, Professor Marco Buti, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I think very inspiring messages have come this morning. The reports by the two organizations who have organized this, I think Commissioner Gentiloni, but also what Frank and Gelsomina have said right now. Now, I think there is one agreement. It seems to me pretty clear. Investment estimates for dealing with the climate transition vary. I mean, Commission go from 500 to 600 billion per year. I think actually the EIB in a report estimated up to 1 trillion of private and public. The Institute for Climate Economics in between 800 billion per year. They have one thing in common: they are large. That is clear. At the same time, I have to say, and here it is one element, and the narrative is important, but the role of events like this, it's also fundamental. It is the counterfactual. Enrico before put the disaster scenario on impact on GDP looking forward. If you look at, let's say, less dramatic scenarios, but look at 2031, 2050, not delivering on the climate neutrality, I mean, estimates by the Commission of last year was about 2.4 trillion of GDP cost of not doing that. Now, there is one thing, and that is the experience, my experience of a few decades of dealing with policymakers. Trying to explain and pass the message on the counterfactual is one of the most difficult things to do. Because it is not incorporated in the forma mentis of politicians and policymakers. So, but we have to insist and keep insisting. So the pedagogical element and pedagogical importance of events like this, I think, is key. Now, since we have to deliver this, such large amount of investments, both private and public, then we need a comprehensive strategy. So I think this is, so we have all the levers, public and private, have to be activated for that. I mean, if you take this comprehensive approach, then one thing that helps me conceptually to try to reason through what to do is to think about delivery and financing EU national. So if you close your eyes and imagine this 2x2 table, I think not difficult to imagine even with open eyes, then you have the four combinations. So, okay, you start with one is in which you have financing at the EU level and delivery at the national level. This is essentially large part of the next generation EU and the RRF. So there is financing, 750 billion initially, then levitated towards 800 plus in nominal terms. 90% of this delivered by the Recovery and Resilience Facility, implemented via the National Recovery and Resilience Plans. With the climate objectives, 37%, and actually virtually all member states have actually exceeded that element, that threshold there. So I think serious implementing of the RRF is key now, but there is a time limit, and we know that end of 2026 is the end of the Next Generation EU. I think it would be short-sighted to do what some governments are trying to do now, which is counting on extension of the Next Generation EU. I don't think that is, I think it's the right approach, because it would mean taking it easy on the delivery now, counting on something that may not happen. And second, I would frankly not spend the political capital in simply having a coda of Next Generation EU post-2026. One can discuss there what it means ending, etc. I think some fixes may be found at the margin, but I think that would, Next Generation EU 2.0 simply as a repetition of Next Generation EU as we have it now, I think it would not happen. So I don't think it would be wise to do so. So this is the combination EU financing national delivery. Then you come to the national. So it's the cell of the four when you have objectives which are shared, and delivery and financing comes at the national level. And here come essentially the new EU fiscal rules. I think both Commissioner Gentiloni and Enrico Giovannini mentioned that. I mean, the approach that we have taken there, I say we with my former hat, when I worked with as Director General of ECFIN and then Chief of Staff of the Commissioner, the idea was, okay, there is no EU money, but we have to play on incentives. And incentives for delivering the right type of investment, combine it with public debt sustainability, is to consider that you have a longer adjustment period, so from 4 to 7 years, if you do the right thing in terms of reform investment. And I think the new regulation just adopted, I think on the 29th of April, was finally adopted and then published, so is the new rules. Clearly identify investment in the preventive arm also for delivering the climate transition as one of the main objectives for lengthening the adjustment period. So you can take it easier on delivering on the fiscal objectives. So you have the possibility to smoothen the adjustment if you put the money to the right use. And I think this should not be belittled, in particular for high debt countries. I mean, take Italy in the first place, that it helps a lot to lengthen from 4 to 7. It creates a room for maneuver on reallocating the resources to investment for the climate transition, which is very sizable, actually. And there has been estimate simulations of old rules versus new rules, and you create a space that has to be used properly. And here, the commitments are for the very short term, actually, because the member states under the new rules will have to put forward medium-term, so-called medium-term structural fiscal plans by the 20th of September, and in that they should also incorporate these, so the reform and investment commitments, in particular for the climate transition. So this is the second combination. The third one is EU-EU. So what you do at the EU level in terms of delivery and what you finance at the EU level. And here, I think, is where the future of Next Generation EU lies. We have 2026 end of Next Generation EU, and we have 2027 is the beginning, so the end and then the beginning of the multi-annual EU budget. I think what one should do here is to think about in terms of European public goods, to deliver on the key priorities that we have, and that is and climate transition is clearly one of the main topics. So I think we have to link. I think on the one hand the implementation of the new fiscal rules, end of Next Generation EU, and beginning of the next multi-annual EU budget in terms of size and composition, and I think doing and addressing the expenditure, the EU expenditure in the direction of the climate transition, I think could help a lot. And the three are linked not only in terms of calendar, they are all basically at the same time, 2026, 2027, but they are also politically linked, because it is clear that in order to recreate a climate of trust amongst member states and institutions, to think about a substantially revamped EU budget, you have to be serious on the implementation of the fiscal rules. So if you are not serious on that, I think you are not recreating the room, the trust that is needed for this, for crossing red lines again, as we did back in 2020 at the time of COVID. And that is, so the three elements here are clearly linked. Overall, let me summarize in one word. I think we have to all struggle to lower the political discount rate. So politicians, they think in terms of a very high discount rate. Today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow is already, in the fog in the future. Now, here we have to lower the discount rate, incorporate those, the interest of the new generations in the next decades, because if we don't do that, the cost will be high. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Buti. And before we move on to further questions, I think it's good to note that we've got 4,500 people connected online. So there's definitely these topics are of great interest here in the room, but also out there. So I think this is a good result. Thanks to all the panelists for this first round. I think I can see a couple of themes emerging, and we've got questions, but I first wanted to start with a little comment to throw to you, maybe as a little question. One is on the importance of messaging, because Professor Buti, you mentioned the difficulty but importance of increasing the counterfactual. At the same time, we have heard from the other panelists on the importance of narrative, the importance of passing on the message of managing risks within financial institutions, the importance of persuading also the wider public as well as those who work in the financial institution on the importance of this. So the first question is, because of all this importance on messaging, do you think that within the financial system there is an understanding and an acceptance of the importance of the transition and therefore orientating their action towards that, or is there a gap that needs to be plugged in this? I don't know if any of you wants to react to this first question. Yes, please.
I can maybe later tell a little bit more about banking supervision.
Yes.
But in terms of messaging, I think what is key, and I think it goes to the counterfactual, what we have done, various economy-wide stress tests. Mm-hmm. And what comes out clearly is that waiting is worse. Kicking the can down the road is worse. So an orderly transition is just so much better. So I think this is, talking about one of the messages, this is one of the key messages that we give all the time. We say we don't make the policies, but we do look at the economy. This is our deep understanding now. So those who mark the pace, those who sign Paris agreements, those who make climate laws, European climate laws, those who make Fit for 55 programs, please be aware, kicking cans down the road is worse. That's maybe the first part of the message. The second part, I think, is we need to be realistic. Realistic in terms of what climate science tells us. So I was very much in agreement with what you said about the discount rate in terms of political timing of things. We think that talking about 2050 is long term. I don't think it is. I think we need to at least think towards the end of this century. The children who were born today here in Rome, they have a life expectancy that brings them squarely into the end of this century. So it's not about future generations. It's also about children born today. And what climate science tells us about the world that we are going to be living in by the end of this century on the present trajectory of 2.9 also means, and this brings me back to the amounts that we need, it's not about just the 620 billion annually additionally to get to the 2030 transition goals. We also need to add to that the finance gap in terms of the adaptation. Adaptation, to be honest, and that's the point that I want to make in terms of being realistic, not to a 1.5 degree world, but adaptation to the world that climate science tells us that we are heading towards. So these numbers are even bigger. Now, and this I will leave to my wiser co-panelist. If you are realistic in what I just said and in the numbers that we need, if you say that waiting is worse, somehow you need to also give people a short-term perspective to not become completely depressed. And I think that is the important thing that politicians need to do.
Absolutely, thank you.
Exactly on this point, I wanted to qualify what I meant by to change the narrative and to push it into a positive. I mean, it's not, actually I perfectly agree that all have to be very conscious of what we expect, what we have in front of us. But, to avoid, the risk that people say, okay, so it's a disaster, we can't do anything, so let's wait for it. No, because, in the end, if you put people in front of a catastrophic scenario without, providing the solution, without providing, the sooner we do, the better we will do. We can afford to do that. What is necessary to do? To provide the incentives to do. So in this way, I say that it's important to have a positive narrative, to say we know what is to happen, but we have the instruments to cope with that. In that sense, what I say is that, for instance, we have talked about what is necessary, but it's not only an issue of finance. We know that many problems are in the regulation. So that maybe, and here there is the discount factor by politicians, so that some measures, for instance, to enhance to put in place the regulation that we need, for instance, to improve the capacity to have more renewable, production. We know that in many instances there are some regulatory barriers that obstacle that. We know that another issue that we have to put on the table is the skills gap. That's another issue which is very important, because we know that the transition will also require some skills that at the moment are not present. So the idea it would be, to cope with this process in a positive way with the public institutions by providing also the private sector the right incentive and the right the possible solution to avoid this type of a catastrophe that it's waiting for us, but we have everyone the responsibility to avoid, so that the world which will expect us, it would be a better world. It can look like an utopia, but I think that, as the sentence that was, rightly highlighted by Professor Giovannini, is something that as public institutions we should work on. And we will talk later about maybe the banking supervision, but also in that sense, I understand from many, small intermediaries having this stress testing on, mitigation risk, transition risk. It can look like, it's a quite an heavy process or something highlighting, it's problems for which it will be necessary to have more provisions. Also in that sense, to accompany this institution in this process by providing the right instrument to support them and providing also what could be the solution. It's a more proactive and positive attitude to the, to the public policy.
Thank you. Yes, and absolutely we do need positive and proactive attitudes. Professor Buti, reacting to this, but also, if I may, you mentioned, obviously you were involved in the creation of the rules of the new Reform, Stability and Growth Pact, although they have changed from the original proposal. But these rules have been criticized in terms of not allowing sufficient fiscal space for the priorities, especially the climate transition priority. But you seem to be positive about the fact that the instrument we have is able to protect these spaces. Is that so? Or do you think, noting also the fact that you're saying that we shouldn't be expecting a new next generation EU after 26 or anytime soon, do you think that, especially from a public finance point of view, we do have the right framework for the transition, or are there areas that probably would need some improvements?
Okay, first, your initial question on awareness of the finance world. I think my feeling here, but ready to be corrected, but my feeling here is that the answer is largely yes. I think we criticize a lot, financial institutions, financial markets, etc. But I think there has been an understanding there, and an increasing one, that this is one of the dimensions of leadership that Commissioner Gentiloni talked about. So, and being at the forefront on this, I think, is an element of helping the competitiveness. And I think Europe think about the issuance of green bonds. We are really at the forefront. I mean, the Commission has done a lot also related to next generation EU common debt. So I think we should pursue that. And I think there is a fertile ground. My feeling is an understanding in financial actors to deliver on that. Let me throw the ball a bit in a broader field. Europe will continue to come from Venus in the future. It's not going to. Okay, we have to equip ourselves for defense and not rely only on because we know the external threats, etc. We are not going to switch coming from Mars. So our leadership in the world, in the global governance, will rely on the kind of leadership in climate transition, in the kind of investment we make, the conditions for financial markets to deliver on that front. So we are clearly in our DNA are positive sum games of this sort, rather than the pure logical power that is dominating now. I think if one looks with a certain optimism to the future, I think we are on the right side of history. So losing that leadership there, I think will have globally also strategically high costs. So this goes well beyond my pay scale, but I think it's important to have this broader perspective in mind. Now, on the fiscal rules, there was some disappointment initially, but also at the end by many who are promoters of the green transition agenda, because they would have preferred a straight golden rule. So you eliminate from the accounts, from the constraints, the amount of investment that are dedicated to the climate transition. And since the beginning, we took a different road, which was what I had tried to explain before, namely, we do not eliminate from the accounts expenditures, which is expenditure nonetheless, even if for good causes, but you get incentives in terms of longer time, a more gradual adjustment, smoothing the correction, and this should provide the right incentives for allocating the money towards the right causes, improving the quality of public finances, also from the point of view of climate transition. There was politically no way to get through a straight golden rule, and I think analytically also I would have strong doubts that that would be the right thing to do. Nonetheless, I think we have to think about how to mobilize the large investment we talked about before. I think golden rule from the point of view of the fairness, cross-country fairness, and there is a lot of discussion now, including in the report on the internal market but just delivered by Enrico Letta, on the fact that if you create space at the national level, and you do that either via certain types of fiscal rules or loosening the state aid regulations, etc., you create discrimination between member states because some have deeper pockets than others, so they can afford certain type of spending more than others. So I think this is not the right way to go. What one should do is to think in terms of establishing the right vertical coordination between what you do at the national level with implementing seriously on all aspects the new rules, and then set up a new EU budget, a new EU multi-year budget, and I mentioned 2027, so it is really in the short term, to provide central resources to deliver investment at the EU level. I mean, just one example that has been put on debate, I think, is evocative of this type of EU. So EU delivery, EU financing, I mentioned before. A European Silk Road on moving from lorries to railways. So high-speed train connecting all Europe. We do not have that. That is a typical investment, cross-country dimension, multi-country, not only a few, which would be helpful both on the climate transition but also on the competitiveness side.
Thank you. That's very clear. We are going towards the end of our panel, but I wanted to come back a little bit to what we were alluding to earlier with Mr. Ellerson. In the wider sense, on the role of the financial sector, but of private banks, in what role they have, what risks they face with the transition and with the costs of climate change. So I know that the ECB is, and especially you are involved in a lot of this, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about this. And maybe also a wider question, maybe for Vice President Vigliotti, on directing the investment where we need, what the tools we have that are available for that, and the issue of green technologies as a means, both technological means to advance the transition, but also as an important driver of competitiveness. Maybe Mr. Ederson, you first.
All right. Well, so as you know, we supervise the major banks in Europe. So about think about the 110 biggest banks, which together are north of 85% of the total European banking balance sheet. So, when we asked the banks in 2019, so do you manage your climate and environmental related risks? Actually, by and large, the answer was no. And we asked them, but do you think this is material? And many said, well, we think it's material. So then we thought, okay, this is not good enough. So we designed a multi-year strategy in order to make sure that all our banks, all the banks under our supervision, I should say, are managing their climate and nature-related risks adequately. So to just, with big strides, take you through that 5 years, in 2020, we published supervisory expectations. This is what we expect you to do to manage your climate-related risks. We asked them in 21, could you do a self-assessment vis-a-vis these expectations? And banks have been very honest and forthcoming, and I know because they were very self-critical. And they said, actually, there's quite a large gap between where we stand and what you expect us to do. So the natural question, of course, on our part was, so how long does it take? And then 85% of the banks said, well, give us till the end of 24. So then we decided, okay, we will make sure that all banks are in compliance with all these expectations by the end of 24 to create a level playing field. So we asked for action plans, and then in 22, we actually went in, because we are a supervisor, so we just don't believe the blue eyes of the banks in terms of self-assessments. We went in ourselves in 22 and we checked how far progress was made, and at the time, my public summary would be, glass is filling, but it's not even half full. This was 22. And extrapolating that speed of progress, we saw that the banks would not get there by the end of 24, so we stepped up our game and we said we will set a number of interim deadlines and this is irrelevant, we will enforce these if needed. I'll come back to that in a second. So these interim deadlines being March last year, you have to do what is fundamental, first step, but it's a fundamental first step, which is a materiality assessment. Is this material? So that was last year. Then end last year, they had to do a number of these expectations, and again, by the end of this year, all. So now we are in the phase that we have looked at how have banks done on that first interim deadline. And of, again, the 110 banks, we issued 23 formal decisions, of which 18 encapsulated the possibility to impose what we call a periodic penalty payment, which is basically an instrument that says if you have not done what you're supposed to do by a certain deadline, each day afterwards you incur a fine. Now, this is not something that we would normally do, so we don't have a long tradition in using these parts of the toolbox, but it's part of our toolbox, and we think this is so important that we use this. Now, where will this lead? This will lead, if all goes well, and actually today, thousands of people within the banks, and I want to compliment them because that also goes to are people, cognizant of the importance. Thousands of people literally are working on this now in the various banks. So banks do take this seriously, partly because they know it is serious and partly because they know we take it seriously. But the combination of these two things lead to real progress. But again, still a lot of work being done. Now, you could have a bank that perfectly manages all its climate and nature-related risks, but still does not really help their clients on the transition that we need, and their clients being, in the end, the real economy. So in the end, but I will say something nuanced to that in a second, but to make the point very clearly, as a supervisor, I cannot go to a bank and say, you're not allowed to give a loan to a coal mine as long as that is still legal. I can, and I do, go to banks and say, if this is what you want to specialize in, you run, of course, a big transition risk because at one day these coal mines will be phased out and not just coal mines. And so I want to know how your business model is going to be resilient to these changes, how you're going to avoid the stranded asset risk that goes with it, etc. So all that to say that a bank can actually only manage their climate and nature-related risks in a structurally adequate manner if they are engaging with their clients for them to be on to put it shortly, a Paris-compatible path. So that's why it is so extremely important to have transition plans for banks, transition plans for their clients, and the ability by banks to develop a set of products and a set of services and a mindset to help their clients make that transition. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. That was very clear. Vice President Vigiotti.
On the financing, the technologies?
Yes.
Okay. As I said, this is one important element of the Repower EU program set forth by the Commission, and we are very much engaged in doing that. Maybe to be clear, I can make some examples. And there is one which strikes me for maybe the simplicity of the idea, but the revolutionary aspect that it can bring with it is a startup in Italy here from Milan, which actually is it's now, and we funded them, that now they are actually setting the first plant for storage of energy just through the transformation of CO2. Without any raw material, and is just from the transformation of the CO2 from the gas status to liquid status, and they are able through this transformation to provide 10 hours of continuity for the renewable. You know that one of the major problems for using renewable is that they cannot ensure the full continuity. So this is the type of a project that we want to support and to to bring them at scale, because actually what we need is and to support also, and actually we are also, technology neutral, so we are ready to fund, whatever type of new ideas, so that in the end we will, because in some fields we don't know what actually would be the potential. Let's think about hydrogen. We are putting there a lot of resources. We see prospect for the green hydrogen, not only here in Europe, but for instance also outside of the European Union. And this is actually to bring to the next debate. Our role is, the European role is also important towards what we can, on how we can support other parts of the world, the south of the world, to develop clean technologies and to produce much more renewables, especially since there are plenty of opportunity. Let's think about Africa, where it's a new projects could be developed, and for instance in Africa we are developing several projects for producing green hydrogen. So in that regard, we believe that it's a field where there is a need for resources coming from the private sector, which could be supported by the public sector as well.
Thank you very much. I think that was this last round was interesting to highlight once again how much climate change considerations are really integrated into the economic and financial system, both in terms of the risks that they face, the way that they can be proactive, the way they can finance new technology, and this links to the issue of competitiveness, which we've seen so far. So it heartens me the fact that also your estimation is that the financial system is well aware of the risks as well as the opportunities of the transition, and maybe now it's a technical conversation to be had on how to find the funds, the public and the private, but mostly how to target them and make sure that we have the orderly and timely transition that was mentioned earlier, and so therefore a transition that not only delivers on the climate targets but also on the economic ones. So once again, thank you very much to all of our panelists. A big round of applause. The next panel will be Eleonora Cogo. We'll take a couple of minutes to change the stage. And thank you very much for all of you for being here.
Già preso questo qui. So welcome back to this second part and second high-level roundtable. Well, we will try to have a look a bit outside our European borders and trying to reflect a little bit on how what is Europe's role in supporting global investment, so to ensure that we achieve this transition all around the globe and also support countries in adapting and facing the consequences of climate change. In the recent weeks, we actually have been, there's been constant reminder of actually how climate action is urgent and is imperative of now. We've seen record breaking heat waves in Southeast Asia, devastating floods in Brazil and in East Africa, but also impacts that actually go beyond local and national borders. For example, in the last few years, the droughts in the Panama Canal have, forced rerouting and consequences for international trade. I think, as was mentioned earlier by Professor Giovannini, there is no doubt that the economic benefits of accelerating the transition vastly outweighs the cost of the avoided damages. And this is, if it's true in Europe, it's even more true around the world when, especially in contexts and countries that have far less capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. And that's why it's important that as we envision this transition, we design it in a way so those benefits are distributed more evenly across the world. We are a bit of a crossroad, right? We know that the scale of the challenge is huge. It's estimated that the annual climate finance to address climate and nature-related development goals in low and middle-income countries, except China, has been estimated around 2.4 trillion by 2030. But at the same time, we know that especially developing countries are being, disproportionately affected, not just by climate impacts, but also by the multiple crises that we have witnesses in the last few years, since the pandemic, but also with the consequences of the war that have really began kind of slowing progress towards the achievement on some sustainable development goals. Was mentioned earlier, we've seen the effect of rising debt servicing costs and the impact that this has on delaying investments in essential needs like education, health, infrastructure, and so on. So, even we've been talking in the previous panel about, the fiscal constraints to achieve this transition, but this is even more true and important in many developing countries operating already in a very, already kind of limited fiscal space. This year, it's also kind of an important anniversary for the Bretton Woods Institution, 80 years since the World Bank and the IMF were created. And I think there is a reflection there about, are they still kind of fit for purpose in terms of accompanying these transitions. There is a debate about ongoing debate about a reform of the international financial agenda, which we'll debate today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three distinguished speakers. Mr. Avinash Persaud. He's a special advisor to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank and was previously a special climate envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. Welcome, Avinash.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Mr. John Asafu Ajayi, resident senior fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation, and he was previously a professor of economics at the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Eleonora. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. And our third speaker, Rachel Kite. She's a professor of practice in climate policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, Oxford, and was formerly Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, as well as CEO of the UN Sustainable Development for All. Welcome, Rachel.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So, over the last few years, we have witnessed a kind of a stronger voice coming from the global side, both kind of voicing what are the kind of challenges and concerns, but also kind of new proposals. And one of those was captured under the Bridgetown Initiative, which has been kind of advocating for overall of the international financial system. We have the pleasure of having here today one of the key architects. So I would like to ask you, Avinash, if you could give us a bit an overview about, the genesis of this initiative, but also, the main proposals that were being put forward and, where we stand today, in terms of its implementation and, where we need to kind of accelerate. Over to you.
Well, that's a lot, and I hope to try and keep my remarks brief because I'm keen to hear Rachel and John as well. So, you mentioned at the beginning that the benefits of this transformation far exceed the costs, which is great in aggregate. But the problem is that the people who benefit and the people who are suffering the costs are very different people. And so we have a classic sort of political economy problem. The rich world, of which Europe is a key part, are people who contributed substantially to greenhouse gas, the stock of greenhouse gases, which causes global warming. It's not the emissions every year, it's the stock, because when they go up there, they stay up there for thousands of years. And places like Africa, which contributed almost nothing to the stock of greenhouse gases, are suffering some of the greatest consequences in terms of the droughts in the Sahel region, etc. And of course, that's not just Africa, but across the band of the tropics, between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, where about 40% of the world live. The cost to them of climate change, according to the IPCC, is almost 4 to 5 times greater than the costs elsewhere. So that's the reason why we have this impasse. One of the previous moderator said, we need an orderly transition. The time's run out for orderly transition. There's only the option for disorderly transition because we need to move so fast. I want to make 3 points. That's the first one. The second point would be that if we look at the fault lines of where action is taking place and where action is not taking place in terms of the green transition, it's along the cost of capital in different countries. And that's because the green transformation, it may appear to be the sun and the wind is free, and people think it's obvious that we should do that, but they're very capital intensive. They cost a lot of money up front. And so where the cost of capital is very high, it's not happening. So, 81% of the green transformation is taking place in developed countries financed by the private sector because the cost of capital is low. Taxes and subsidies are the right solution where cost of capital is low. Where the cost of capital is high, then you put a tax on carbon. You're not going to get switching out of carbon. You're going to get a decline of production. It's going to be developmentally very regressive. And that's why developing countries have been slow to put those taxes on. We need to find ways of reducing the cost of capital. So my final remark would be the other challenge is we kind of aggregate these things up and mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, adaptation, making ourselves more resilient to the current climate change already baked in, and loss and damage are 3 very different things, and you would finance them very differently. With mitigation, which generates revenues, then we need to get the private sector involved through taxes and subsidies in rich countries. And in the developing world, we need to find ways of reducing the cost of capital. And the principal component of the cost of capital tends to be foreign exchange risk. And that's the cost that foreign exchange investors have in hedging their risk in going to these countries. Why can they not just use domestic capital? The amount of investment we need far exceeds their domestic savings. In terms of adaptation, so my final couple remarks, in terms of adaptation, the private sector often says they can do adaptation. They want to do adaptation. That's because their concept of adaptation is a bit different. They believe it's about making buildings stronger, etc. But a lot of adaptation, especially in developing countries, are public goods. They are seawalls, flood defenses, drainage systems. The private sector has no revenues there. We need the developing banks to be playing a much bigger role. They need to be 3 times bigger, focused on financing adaptation at low cost. And my final point would be loss and damage. That is something for which there's no revenues, there's no savings. We need grants. There are limited numbers of grants in the world, so we need perhaps new taxes to help to generate the money needed for loss and damage. Italy was one of the most generous contributors to the new loss and damage fund. With a $100 million contribution. The fund's got about $800 million. It needs $100 billion per year. So we need new taxes, $1 on a barrel of oil, $1 on the equivalent on coal and gas would get us to the kind of numbers we need, but we need that action. Thank you very much.
Also, you know that you've taken up the role as a board member in this new loss and damage fund. So maybe it'd be nice to come back later to that in terms of how we actually funded and, you know. So I would like now to pass the mic to John. We have seen kind of another very strong voice emerging through last year, especially among kind of African leaders that during the African Climate Summit in September agreed on a Nairobi communiqué. So I'd like to ask you if you could give us a bit of a sense of what were the kind of challenges highlighted and also what kind of solutions were being put forward to finance a more just transition. Over to you, John.
Right. Thank you, Eleonora. So I'll talk about some of the challenges that we face and what Europe could do to assist. So just as a background material, for Africa, 57% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity, and only 17% have access to clean cooking solutions, and most of them rely on biomass to meet their thermal household needs. So for Africa, the net zero transition is not just a climate issue, but it's also a development issue. But we've seen from the African Climate Summit 2023 held in Nairobi that Africa's narrative on climate change has changed. Africa now sees the net zero transition as an opportunity to create green jobs and reduce poverty. And so 45 countries out of 54 are fully on board to contribute to the Paris Agreement. But Africa faces challenges, as you mentioned, Leonora. One is the issue of climate finance. On average, African countries have submitted very ambitious targets in their nationally determined contributions, but only roughly about 25% of the total cost can be met from domestic sources due to poor domestic revenue mobilization. So about 75% of this money has to come from external sources, including loans, grants. Some countries may have to borrow from capital markets, but we know that interest rates are high and much higher for African countries than for other countries. The other side of the issue is that Africa receives less climate finance than Asia and the Americas. For example, between 2013 and 2030, Africa received 29% of total climate finance, while Asia receives 46%. But what we are seeing is that the growing impacts of climate change and the increasing frequency of climate-induced natural disasters are forcing countries to take on much higher levels of debt in order to cope with these situations. In fact, the increasing debt burdens many countries from achieving their NDCs and even their SDGs, because there's very little fiscal space. But at the same time, having said this, there are opportunities. The cost net zero transition could actually create green jobs. Just to give you an example, at a carbon price of at least $10 per ton, about 40 million jobs can be created annually. And if the price of carbon is $50 per ton, 86 million jobs can be created from nature-based solutions. Also, carbon markets present an opportunity. At a carbon price of $120 per ton of carbon, Africa can make up to 82 billion from carbon credits. The problem, though, is that present Africa only generates 2% of its annual potential from carbon credits. A key challenge is to really get a fair price for Africa's carbon. What are some of the solutions? Well, on the debt and climate finance, there's a need to accelerate reforms on the MDBs to make climate finance more available to Africa and other developing countries. There's also the need to increase the number of no interest and low interest funding from the MDBs. There's a need to accelerate the rechanneling of SDGs to make more money available to banks, regional banks, such as the African Development Bank, on lending for climate finance and adaptation. On the energy transition, there's a need for more FDI from the global north to assist with renewable energy development and infrastructure. There's a need for more technology transfer from the global north, and there's a need for capacity building as well. So generally, African countries also have to do their part. They need to improve their domestic business environment to be able to attract foreign direct investment. We need to improve governance issues such as corruption and inefficiencies in the public sector. And basically, we need to improve the policy and regulatory environment. So let me hand back to you, Eleonora, and I'll pick up other issues during the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I think you've mentioned a lot of very interesting aspects from specific challenges that Africa, but also, debt and how that it really is kind of impeding progress and the transition, but also begin putting forward some of the solution proposals. So maybe we'll come back to those later. But before we do that, I would like to pass the mic to Rachel. And I'd like to ask you, you coming from looking at your background in London right now, but so trying to capture a little bit more from European and UK perspective, right? How do you kind of evaluate the current responses being provided by Europe and G7 more largely? Where do you see maybe also a bit of kind of lack of coherence between what is being said and what is being done? And where do you think that actually Europe could have a greater impact in this kind of global conversation?
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. And I'm one of those Brits that is staunchly European. So, but it's also good to follow Avi and John and just add a little bit more texture to what they've already said, looking at it from sort of the responsibility, really, of the G7 and European leadership here. And I think just to sort of take off where John left off, there was a broad consensus last year that the international financial architecture is not working, right? I think in 21 and 22, there was a lot of push back on the system, like it is not fit for purpose. And Avi led a lot of that work, and there was critique coming from other places as well. I think last year there was sort of a violent agreement that, the system is not fit for purpose. And that was even sort of in the G20 communique from New Delhi. Now it's like, okay, well, if it's not fit for purpose, how are we going to fix it? And we have sort of small bore ideas around how the current system and the institutions in the current system, whether they be development banks or bilateral development financial institutions or the IMF or whatever, what they need to do their job better, while there's a conversation going on about, in fact, their missions need to slightly change course, and there are things that need to be done in the teeth of a development crisis, a debt crisis, and a crisis of inequality and a nature crisis that will require us to do different things. Right in the middle of that is the responsibility of advanced economies. And we, at the moment, see more financial flows out of emerging markets and developing economies than we do in. And that's because of interest rates. But that's across all forms of finance, concessional finance, non-concessional finance, and private finance. We also see, I think more and more tied aid and more analysis that a lot of the grants that are going in, not only from development financial institutions, but also from philanthropy, reflow back into the advanced economies. So the development system's not working. And on the top of that development system, the development finance system, we're loading on expectations of much more financing for meeting the climate challenge, both on the mitigation side, so the need for green infrastructure, green growth, but also then the extraordinary amounts that are going to be needed to build resilience into economies, which is going to really bring a focus into the fiscal policies of countries. So I'll just leave that to one side and just focus on where I think we are at the moment, which is that I think that there is the beginning of a reform agenda underway within the multilateral development banks, where, of course, the Europeans and G7 members make up the bulk of the ownership. We then see I think some innovation and some new ideas coming through bilateral financial institutions of European and G7 member countries. But I think where there's an enormous responsibility is that over the last 20 years, we've seen an extraordinary fragmentation in the development finance space. And now we're seeing even more fragmentation as people come up with boutique solutions to pieces of the climate finance flow problem. And I think there is going to be a huge responsibility for Europe, individual members of the European Union, the UK, and other members of the G7 to resist the temptation to further fragment and to be able to pool capital, whether it's concessional or in different forms, in larger amounts with easier terms of entry than is the case at the moment. I'm sure John and Avi would agree that sitting in the seat of a emerging market developing economy minister of finance or planning or whatever, the array of potential acronyms or streams of finance with different terms and conditions, different risk appetites, and different expectations of return is off-putting, to say the least. And so there is a responsibility on the supply side to sort out how we do this. The second thing is that there is a responsibility to mobilize more finance and to correct the flow away from emerging markets and developing economies. And that means speeding up the debt agenda. There is no solution to climate finance unless we resolve the situation that many countries find themselves in, which will only get worse as climate impacts start to take a bigger and bigger impact on GDP. So there is a responsibility of G7 and Europe to get their own house in order in their own bilateral programs, collaborate more cleanly so that the capital is pooled in a way which is more accessible, and then to have coherence between what capitals are saying politically, what their board representatives are saying on all of these different institutions, and then the instructions that they're giving to the staff and management of multilateral or bilateral funds. At the moment, it's very clear that there is lots of room for sort of a constructive ambiguity, and that's slowing things down. So we can see development and finance institutions competing with each other for a very meager stream of projects, for example, in grid-connected solar in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because different institutions are all trying to meet their climate finance targets. Different institutions have slightly different approaches to risk appetite and pricing. And at the end of the day, their shareholders are the same countries, their owners are the same countries. And so there is a responsibility, I think, in Europe to send a clearer pulse from the supply end of the climate finance agenda. There's much more to say about, I think, some of the things that could happen to scale some of this finance. But as I said, there is a responsibility in Europe to get behind some of the ideas for reform more vigorously. And the final one I would put is that Minister Haddad, the finance minister of Brazil, has put on the table wealth taxes. And I think we would look to the G7 to see what the response to that is. Because as Avi said, we are going to need new and creative ways to raise revenue for the needs that we have, while countries start to work on their basic fiscal policies as they see the difficulty of meeting political expectations at home, meeting their Paris target needs, and managing public debt. So it would be great to see a G7 response to a constructive idea on wealth taxes put on the table by the chair of the G20.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I would like to go a little bit more in depth around some of those kind of important points that you've all been raised, and some of the kind of emerging proposals, for how they kind of G7. Obviously we are in Italy today, and Italy is holding the G7 presidency, and so how they can bring forward the agenda on some of those issues, especially looking towards mid-June with the Leaders Summit, and actually in a couple of weeks with the Finance Minister Summit. So I'd like to go back a little bit more, taking it a bit from specific solutions that we need for mitigation. Then we'll look at adaptation and loss and damage, because I think, as Javi was hinting earlier, they also need very different solutions. So. Looking at the private sector, what could be done to really create the conditions to really incentivize the private sector to invest also in the most kind of vulnerable regions? And, what are the kind of financing mechanisms that can bring on board, private investments and, aligning those investments, obviously, with the climate objectives? And also, also reflecting on a little bit on, where do you also see, Rachel was hinting earlier about a bit of lack of policy coherence, right? And so where we're still kind of investing perhaps too much on fossil fuels, but also keeping in mind that, we need to do it in a just way. It's important that the element of the just transition. I'd like to kind of, along those lines, to hear from all of you. I will give the floor first to Avinash.
Great, an important question, and an area where I think Rachel makes a really powerful point about the need for greater, less fragmentation in the system. I think there's a role for some experimentation in the system, but there certainly is a need for a less fragmentation. And the multilateral development banks, the heads of the multilateral development banks, met together in Washington a few weeks ago and agreed to greater convergence around a number of things, 6 big things: callable capital, procurement, practices, how do we measure impact, because everyone wants to be a climate bank these days, how do we measure results, and foreign exchange. And I think on the first group of those things, convergence is required. On foreign exchange, I think still perhaps more experimentation to see what works best. And let me drill down a little bit on that. So the problem we're facing is well described by a number of pieces of research by the IEA, by IRENA, by the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, which is this cost of capital problem. A utility-sized solar farm in Italy, the cost of capital is around 4 percentage points per year. That's a weighted cost of capital, equity and debt. In South Africa, the equivalent, same tech, same power purchase agreement, the cost of capital is 14%. Now, why is that? Now, what that means is that, if the rate of return is the same or similar, then the investor is there's not going to be sufficient profit for the company where the cost of capital is 14%. And that's why financing is not flowing there. We're seeing that financing is flowing to places where cost of capital is low. Now, what is that cost of capital 14% about? Most development banks are project financiers, and most project financiers think, well, we need to reduce the risk of the project, the risk of the sector, and those things are important. And in fact, a lot of stuff is being done on that. on trying to create more insurance and risk reduction. But look at the cost of capital of lending to the South African government. But there's no project risk issue, there's no regulatory issue, there's no sector issue, it's the government. And that's 12%. That's telling you that the bulk of this cost of capital is a macro problem. It's a country credit foreign exchange problem. And so we need to find a way of reducing that. If we don't reduce that, the ability of us to reduce the project risk and regulatory risk is actually very limited. We need to do it, but it's very limited. Why would we think it's not limited? There is tremendous regulatory uncertainty in Italy, in Britain, in Europe on where we're going on renewables. Does anyone know what the Italian country plan is for renewables? So why do we say these developing countries, they need to have country plans, they need to do all this stuff? Yes, they do, but that's not going to drive the difference. It's the foreign exchange risk. So the Inter-American Development Bank has just launched a pilot with about $5.4 billion behind it. And what we're doing there is we're trying to say, well, the reason why you have to pay so much money for hedging your foreign exchange is you're asking an international bank, say, let's say an Italian bank, to hedge the risk of the South African rand falling against the euro. And it's a long-term 20-year risk. The risk of the South African rand falling is very pro-cyclical. It falls exactly the same time as Italy itself is having economic challenges and risks. And so the banks charge big risk premiums. And the only way we can reduce this is by unpacking the risk and removing the risk. So in the IDB platform, what we do is we say that the projects are able, over time, to raise their prices in line with local inflation. No more, but in line. That reduces a third of the foreign exchange risk, which is to do with differential inflations. Then we say we're only working in countries with stable macroeconomic frameworks. That means things like inflation targeting central banks. It means fiscal rules, and that reduces another third of the foreign exchange risk we need to hedge. And then what's left are these extreme lurches in periods of great turmoil in the world, where people flee to safe havens. And there the Inter-American Development Bank, a AAA-rated institution, says, well, at that point, we'll come in and we'll lend long-term money at our AAA-rated level to the project in order for them to pay their investors on time. And so that way we've unpacked and reduced the foreign exchange risk to something that collapses the cost of capital and we hope will unblock the flow of private finance to developing countries.
Thank you, Avi. I'll pass the floor to John. I don't know if you're still connected.
Yes, I'm connected, but there's a power cut here, so I'll turn on my video to conserve some energy and bandwidth. Yeah, so I'd like to pick up a few issues about the just energy transition from the African standpoint. What we've observed is that across the developing world, especially in Africa, more finance goes to climate mitigation than adaptation. And so, of course, we've done a little bit of research on that, and it turns out that, I suppose mitigation is more attractive for foreign companies and governments because they can see the outcomes in terms of a number of CO2 removed from the atmosphere or avoided. But, there's a need to also fund adaptation. So, in fact, if you look at the Paris Agreement, there is a clause somewhere which literally calls for equal funding for adaptation and mitigation. In Africa at the moment, the needs are very high due to the intensity of climate extreme events which are climate related. And so there's a need to do that. Now, for the just energy transition for Africa, we need to really address the climate, the energy access problem. As I mentioned earlier, more than half the population do not have access to electricity and clean cooking. So here, I think the dicey issue or controversial issue is really the use of gas as a transition fuel. I think this issue needs to be addressed, needs to be on the table for the G7, because in the short term, that's the only way that the energy access issue can be addressed, by ramping up gas production. And in fact, at COP28, I think there was sort of a tacit agreement that this could be done. But at the moment, countries face a big challenge because the US and Europe are not funding any fossil fuel projects, and that includes natural gas. So I think the issue of natural gas should really be on the table as a short-term measure to achieve the energy access, which I say is very crucial. Then the other issue that needs to be addressed is really the price of carbon in Africa. Carbon is the same in Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. In Africa, it's the price of carbon is less than $10 per ton, whilst in Europe and US and other places, it's over $120 per ton. One of the issues is really Africa being seen as a risky place for investment. And I think that's what's driving this. It's behind that. And of course, there are other issues to do with bureaucratic inefficiencies. There are issues to do with, especially when you come to carbon markets, the issue of land titles, property titles, which are not well documented in Africa. And of course, there are issues to do with corruption and inefficiencies. So that has to be addressed from the African side. But I think from the global north side, we need to really address this issue of risk, because actually studies have shown that the returns to renewable energy projects in Africa can be actually quite high. And I think Avinash mentioned work done by the CPI, and there's evidence to show that returns are quite high. But there's this notion that Africa is a risky place to invest. And I think that needs to be done. I think the African Union has spoken about even trying to regulate the risk companies that do risk assessment. And maybe this could be taken at the level of the G7 or G20 to be able to address that. So I think those issues need urgent attention. So let me pass it back to you, Eleonora.
Thank you, John. Yeah, definitely the clean energy transition is the main goal in terms of kind of ensure that it can also kind of empower a transition that is just and kind of recognizing that there are kind of different priorities, but definitely we'll all benefit. The lowest we can keep the global temperature in terms of then the kind of impact and consequences that will be faced. But I think as was recalled by many earlier, clearly there is a different kind of historical responsibility, and so that should also kind of be reflected. I'll just pass it over to Rachel for your reflection.
Yeah, I mean, just I'll come back to energy at the end, but just to build off Avi, who I think really took the need for local currency guarantees and financing. These are structural issues that have been around for a long time. They really need to get fixed, and they are fixable. And it requires political will and it requires collaboration. But there's no reason why we can't do this. I think I think that there is significant work to be done to support countries to put in place better investment climates, better business enabling environments in order for finance to flow. The amount of technical assistance going in to help countries deepen and make more liquid their capital markets, put in place utility reform regulation, all of these kinds of things is less now than it was 10, 15 years ago. And the way in which that support is provided needs to be changed. You can't have consultants flying in and flying out from developed countries. We need to build that capacity, in Africa, in East Africa, West Africa, whatever, and we need to do it at scale. That will start to produce a broader pipeline, a richer pipeline of investable projects. But we are still going to have a significant gap between where the private sector perceives the risk to be, and therefore what kind of support it needs and its expectations of return and what is possible to achieve. And that's where the MDBs and concessional finance and blended finance are supposed to play. But I think what we see in a lot of the blended finance is that the subsidy is actually going to support the position of the multilateral development bank or the development finance institution. We're not applying the subsidy to the project. So I think there's a lack of discipline, which needs to be corrected, and where I think European shareholders of these development finance institutions need to lean in a little bit more aggressively. Secondly, I think they do have to take more risk at the end of the day. And I think that that's where the fitness for purpose comes in. So there needs to be more aggressive risk taking. That doesn't mean to say that we start throwing money out of the window, but there is room for the shareholders to instruct the management of the banks to be to take more risk in whichever form they want to do that for a time-bound period. We have a crisis. We need to be responding to it. There is also, I think, there's lots of really sort of technical issues around how we measure leveraging and crowding in and who measures what. And I think that some discipline around that and that conversation has started to happen within the MDBs would actually help bring clarity. And with clarity, hopefully you can build scale. I think there are also things that are around the corner which we need to be looking at, which you would traditionally expect the MDB and the IMF system to be doing. I think insurance is very important. Worldwide, the protection gap is just growing. That means that, we know that in most emerging markets and developing economies, there is, most assets are and people are either uninsured or underinsured. That's actually a phenomenon in Europe as well. Only 23% of climate losses in the EU in 2023 were insured. Right. So, and then when we think about the fact that the availability and the affordability of insurance is becoming more difficult, and we're heading into, decades of severe climate impacts, how are we going to transfer risk, and how are we eventually going to help manage that risk without effective insurance markets? So these are the kinds of things where you would expect to see the MDB system or the development finance system doing some really deep technical thinking and helping countries think through this. Just on energy, I think the problem with so the world is unfair, right? Nobody was interested in investing in gas until Europe needed gas quickly because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Gas doesn't come quickly. It takes a lot of time from concept or from through to the actual delivery of gas. And let's remember that gas is going for export. And so then you have to hope that the proceeds from that export is going to be ploughed into the extension of energy services to parts of countries that don't have any, or to the parts of the population and the small business community that doesn't have reliable energy. And to date, that's never happened, or very rarely happened. Kenya is a great example in terms of closing its energy access gap from about 70% to 20% in very few years. But it did that by investing in renewables, and it did that by using new digital and decentralized technologies to make sure that people could pay as they go and get access to good quality, reliable energy. So I don't think it's a gas, no gas discussion. I don't think it's a fossil fuel, no fossil fuel discussion. It is what is the pathway for the delivery of reliable energy across the African continent, and as clean as possible. And why is the financing for that not coming? Right? Why is it possible to finance offshore gas, for delivery to Europe, but it's not possible to build the kinds of aggressive capital pools for the transmission lines which are needed to bring concentrated solar power from Morocco through the Sahel? Those are big political, geopolitical questions for the European Union, for the G7. And we're going to need those kinds of large utility scale renewable energy investments And to date, we have not yet been able to mobilize ourselves around that. And that's really the call to action, rather than standing back and having a gas, no gas discussion, pitting Africans against each other. If you'll forgive me, John, I don't mean to talk about you, but to talk about what Europe needs to do to support you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think you did very rightly putting back the responsibility on also who is kind of providing the financing and where the money is going. So I would like to touch a little bit more. We talked extensively about what is impediments on investment in the mitigation, and clearly MDB is a key player in this regard. But looking a little bit more now on the on managing the impact of climate change, and as was mentioned earlier, those have kind of very unevenly distributed and clearly make up a significant part of the cost of facing the climate transition for many developing countries, especially in those that actually don't have very high emissions. So I would like to talk a little bit about that in terms of, yes, we need more finance, but also better finance. You've already kind of touched upon earlier about the need for more grants and concessional loans and so on, and but also we mentioned also about new sources of finance, right? So we need to kind of look a bit more kind of innovative solutions, and some of those were mentioned earlier about new forms of taxation. There are some already proposals on the table by the G20 that definitely the G7 should be more supportive, but also kind of an ongoing process to build a framework convention on international tax cooperation. So I'd like to hear a bit more your views around how do we finance resilience and how do we finance dealing with the impacts of climate change. I'll start with you, Avish.
It's a really important question because I think people tend to lump all these things together, and they are very different. So adaptation is vitally important, especially in developing countries. In terms of the total bill, it's probably a smaller bill than the bill for the mitigation of the world, the green transformation of the world, but it's a big bill. But the problem is there are very few revenues attached to it. And so the private sector is not financing adaptation today. Less than 3% of adaptation in the world is financed by the private sector. And if you look at that in developing countries, it'll be even less. And I don't think they will, because there are no revenues attached. That's why we need the multilateral development banks to really step up to the plate and fill that gap. They need to be 3 times bigger. And they need to be focused on adaptation. Mitigation, private sector, that's sexy stuff. Everyone wants to talk about it. I have some ideas out there on foreign exchange and galvanizing the private sector. Everyone wants to talk about the private sector. But the reality is that there is some old-fashioned lending that needs to be done. Multilateral development banks lending to a government to build a seawall. Seawalls are very expensive. They're public goods. I can't say someone's protected and you can pay, and someone's not protected and you don't pay. It's a public good. And so development banks need to lend low cost and long term. If they lend 50-year money rather than 15-year money, which they tend to do, it actually dramatically reduces this cost. Now, what is required for that? They need to really, we need to get our hands around the callable capital issue. We need to really make sure that the headroom for lending is by the development banks is not being artificially reduced by a fragmentation view to build on something Rachel said earlier on callable capital. So let's converge, have a clear template of what callable capital is, what it can be used for, and let's allow some lending. Now, a lot's happened, but the headroom for lending has increased by around $400 billion in the multilateral development banks over the past 2 years as a result of people building on the CAF reforms recommended earlier, and some pressure from Bridgetown and others So $400 billion, it's good. It's only a quarter of the way where we need to be. We need to be more like $2 trillion of increased lending room. So that is the way I think we do with adaptation. Now, loss and damage. So, and the reason why we could do that for adaptation is that when you invest in adaptation, when you invest in that seawall, there's a stream of future savings. Every $1 we spend, we save around $6 or $7 in the future. So you could borrow money and pay it back through these savings. You can't do that for loss and damage. When your low-income community has been wiped out because of a hurricane, and I'm here in Dominica because of my role I played here after Hurricane Maria wiped out 226% of GDP. All of low-income homes washed away. There are no savings from building that back. That's a cost. And there we need new revenue streams for these countries that contributed nothing to the problem that they're being inflicted with. Unfortunately, insurance can't help out on this particular problem because it's an uninsurable event, a rising risk of a rising correlation of a rising loss. However, we need new revenue streams and we need new taxes. I think Brazil's putting wealth taxes on the table is important. I think we also need to consider new flows that will ultimately be taxing emissions. And so we will help to push emissions down. I think fossil fuel taxes. I think a single carbon tax around the world is problematic because different countries are in different stages. Maybe we have a different structure of developing countries pay a different tax than others. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms may make sense for Europe, but they are anti-development. And so we need a way of rechanneling the revenues from those carbon border adjustment taxes back to help to finance developing countries' green transition. New taxes. There's a new committee set up by France. I think Germany's involved, and Colombia's involved, and Kenya's involved, and Barbados. And we need Italy to join. We need to think about new sources of tax revenues. I think $1 on a barrel of oil is an easy thing to do that will generate some revenues. And my final point would be, we have mechanisms. You know, when we've spent about 20 to 30 years fighting for a loss and damage fund for developing countries. When the Torrey Canyon oil tanker spilled oil in the English Channel between England and France, within 5 years there was a fund. And it was for everyone to pay. For every time there was an oil spillage, the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, which extracts a small levy on every export of oil when there's a spillage. And we need to do something similar because this is the biggest pollution we're trying to deal with.
Thank you very much. I like this also very concrete example and the fact that you touch also about kind of some of the constraints posed by some policies like CBAM, obviously designed with a good intent of protecting from kind of unfair competition, but clearly having some intended or unintended consequences that needs to be very kind of carefully considered for a more constructive cooperation globally. So, John, over to you. I hope you're still connected.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, yes, I'm still connected, just that you can't see me.
Yeah.
Talking about the new forms of finance, there are a few options that Africa could explore. The first one is debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. We heard about the Gabon deal recently. But if you look at Africa's vast carbon stocks, there is a big opportunity to actually scale this up across the continent, which will give governments more fiscal space to undertake energy transition and also development issues that they are unable to do so. I also mentioned that the carbon markets also represent an opportunity, especially even if you take the regulated markets like the REDD+ and CDM, you still see that African participation is quite low compared to Asia and other parts of the world. There are also opportunities for the voluntary compliance markets, where again African participation is under 2% of the total potential. So of course there are issues to be addressed from the African side as well as from the global north side, but this represents a big opportunity. There's also the potential to apply carbon pricing. Now, I have done some research on carbon pricing in Africa, even looking at the effects of the CBAM and other such measures. Definitely a carbon price or similar measures like an ETS is not really a one-size-fits-all solution to raise funds in Africa, especially for small countries with small carbon footprints. And countries that have low levels of industrialization. Carbon price may not be the best solution to raise funds, but we could also look at alternative measures such as removal of fuel subsidies. Nigeria has just done that, and level of fuel subsidies is quite high in most parts of Africa. But another source of funding which has not been exploited is the private sector funding. Especially for mitigation and adaptation. Of course, adaptation is always a challenge because private firms do not see immediate return on their investment. But even there are some areas that they could be encouraged to invest. But certainly in mitigation projects in renewable energy, most of these projects are being done by government, but there is the opportunity for both the domestic and foreign capital to be attracted into these areas where they can help with development of infrastructure and also building technological know-how. So overall, I think there are good opportunities in these areas in terms of raising extra finance to fund the transition as well as the development projects. But I think what is required from the G7 Global North in general is really the issue of technology transfer, which is very critical. Africa has 60% of the world's critical minerals. And this is another opportunity to collaborate with foreign capital to exploit these critical minerals which are needed for the transition. What we don't want to see is just shipping out these products out of the country, which is currently being done. We want to see more processing being done on the continent, which will also create jobs rather than shipping the raw materials outside to be processed. And we would also want to see the issues to do with exploitation of labor, especially low levels of labor. We want the labor to be just in terms of how they're treated and how they're paid. And currently, we see that there are lots of poor people working under very poor conditions, extracting these minerals for very little pay. And they do this under poor environmental conditions. So I think these are issues that need to be addressed. But overall, I think there are really opportunities to scale up the level of finance. This, however, will require working with the Global North to work on these joint investment projects. So back to you, Eleonora.
Thank you, John. And I'll pass the mic straight to Rachel for final comments.
Yeah, well, so I think the good news is that we're increasingly talking about tax and fiscal policy, which of course we have to, but we spent a long time sort of focused on sort of bombastic statements about mobilization of private finance. We need both. And perhaps, having diagnosed that the international system's not fit for purpose and spending a lot of time on MDB reform, we really have to focus on the IMF now. At the meeting of the finance ministers on climate, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate, at the spring meetings just a few weeks ago in Washington, Kristalina Georgieva said, there are two things that finance ministers have to do, that only finance ministers have to do. One, effectively price carbon. Two, get rid of subsidies, right? So the question then is, and the IMF has done great research and really extraordinarily useful and high quality work on all of this. And they publish it. But is that the conversation the IMF is having with countries when they're doing their sort of health checks, their Article 4 reviews, etc.? And the answer is no, I think. And so there's again room for G7 and European shareholder pressure on the board of the IMF and in support of the staff there to step up. Tax to GDP ratios are too low in most emerging markets and developing economies. How to support them to mobilize more domestic finance, which includes, I think, raising those tax ratios in some ways, this is difficult structural growth issues, and it has to be a focus. Secondly, we focus on trying to mobilize more money to invest in the green growth. For those countries that are, long and public sector entanglement with dirty energy, managing the wind down of brown as we wind up the green, it poses fiscal management challenges as well. And because there's going to be tax revenue lost as the fossil fuels are diminished within the economy. So much more work in support of countries to be able to figure that through as well. And then we've got carbon pricing effectiveness. We haven't got time to get into CBAM in detail here, but one of the immediate impacts of this sort of testing phase of CBAM is that, I think both the private sector and countries are recognizing that they don't want to pay penalties into the EU. And so what are the policy responses that would help ensure that capital stays within their own boundaries? And perhaps the way in which CBAM was introduced was not great, the unilateral action, but the idea that the concept of border adjustment is not a bad one. It's the question of how to do that. And of course, that puts a light on the WTO and the very difficult political environment that the head is trying to mobilize her way through there. Very quickly, I think there's going to be a significant need for sort of almost structured dialogue or mediation, because at the moment everybody's talking about these new innovative ways of raising taxes. The commission that Avi talked about with Kenya, France, and a number of other countries leading it. I think anecdotally, everybody has a view on what if we are able to introduce those taxes on business class air travel, on bunker fuels, on financial transactions, on war taxes on oil and gas profits, whatever we're talking about. Everybody has an idea about the use of those proceeds. They're going to be used for loss and damage. They're going to be used for adaptation. They're going to be used for this, that, the other. And I think there's going to have to be some serious work over the next year, 2 years to sort of prevent us having a big family fight. And at the end of the day, countries need to decide what their development priorities are, and the flows have to go into that. And then I think, maybe not for the G7 this year, not for the EU this year, but we're getting to the point where all development is taking place in the context of a changed world because of climate impacts. And the way in which we measure adaptation financing as a vertical doesn't really reflect the fact that social safety nets and the ways in which countries support the most vulnerable within their communities are going to have to be able to flex to cope with the impacts of climate change. So again, social safety nets, fiscal policy, insurance, all of these things will need to come to the fore in order to be able to be more resilient to what we've done. Finally, something that is on the agenda and has to be something that the G7 leads on, given that they've agreed to it again and again and again, is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. We've punted this down the road for 20 years. It's been agreed to by the G7 before Paris. It's been reconfirmed. It's been agreed to by the G20. There used to be peer working groups on how to do it. It's difficult politically. But if you think about the policy trilemma that the IMF talks about, it's right in the middle of that. This is one of the policy tools available. And while we worry about how to raise the 3 trillion for climate change and SDGs, if we're spending more than 7 trillion on subsidies which are harmful, this is something where the political leadership of the G7 in Europe is necessary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel, for that. And it's definitely a great point of coherence to keep in mind. So unfortunately, we run out of time, and I couldn't even attempt to summarize what has been really an amazing conversation. I really thank you for having really put forward some really concrete ideas. A lot of those are really kind of actionable ideas that, you know, can be, some are being implemented, but those that are on the way need to really be accelerated, and a lot of those really just require a lot more political will. I think it's going to be interesting to see how a lot of this kind of conversation will converge at the end of the year in the definition of the new collective quantified goal that will be agreed at COP29. So, because I think a lot of those, you know, really, both in the frameworks and in terms of the solution, fit very well in that discussions, which will pay close attention in the rest of the year. But for now, thank you very much for having engaged in this conversation and really kind of brought this worldview into our room today. And thank you again for joining us. I will...
Thank you, and thanks for having us.
Thank you, and bye. And I will now hand over to Professor Giovannini and Luca for some concluding remarks. So.
Grazie, davvero. Thank you, Eleonora. I don't know if our international participants are still online, but I wanted really to thank them for this picture from outside Europe, and I just want to just say a few words on that. For us, it's very important, as we heard, that Europe and Italy understand the responsibility that they have, but I think more importantly that there is a common interest or a global common interest that we need to together understand and work towards. So it's just not only about responsibility and public goods, but really about what is the common interest. And with the presidency of the G7, Italy has the opportunity to frame a conversation in the global north that really help country in the global north become bolder on financial reforms in particular. And that's what we hope to see this year in June, but also following. Secondly, I think as we approach the European election, of course, we're also thinking about, after the European election, how the agenda of the new Commission will look like. And I think we've heard today, both in the first panel and the second panel, many great ideas that we need to convey and try to communicate and strengthen as well as the new Commission will take place, will form, and will set out the agenda for the next 5 years. We believe we need to create more space here in Europe to hear voice from the global south and internationally. And so we're very happy that international speaker could join. And finally, yes, the role of public finance for us is really key, and also how the budget laws of European member states will take shape over the next year or so. We will be working on a reform of the fossil fuel subsidies this year, and so I was really encouraged to hear how important it is and the work that needs to be done. This is just one of many things. But from our side, I want to thank again ASVIS to host us, and I think it's a great opportunity for Italy to discuss this, but also it's a great service in the public interest to have this conversation about sustainable development and how we can shape the public debate and the public policy
moving forward. So thank you, Enrico, and all the organization behind the festival.
Thank you very much, Luca. I switch to Italian. Grazie per questa mattinata.
Thanks for spending this busy morning with us. We have listened to major topics. Let me try and summarize with reference to Europe and Italy. Yes, we need what Gentiloni said, continuity. Continuity with adjustments if needed. Indeed, the EU has gained its leadership role in 2019. As Gentiloni said, we submitted, we put forward these ideas, launching the Green Deal. The other countries looked at us a bit puzzled. What are you thinking? During COP28, all countries, some differences, stated decarbonization by 2050. Meanwhile, we have all realized that this is quite complex, and that's where coherent policies become paramount. Frank Elderson, on behalf of the European Central Bank, well explained how Finance 2 is heading for the desired direction in different ways. The need to accompany subjects that are not green at all, to help them take the right path. No fiscal mechanisms create incentives to follow this direction. Vigliotti, Vice President Vigliotti, stressed how EIB is an important instrument to create a leverage for private investors to have for transitions. I tried to demonstrate this morning that this goes beyond the transition. It also looks at innovation. It's a quality leap for the economic system to accelerate sustainable development. A couple of minutes ago, Luca stressed the same point. This is not just about Europe. Europe and Italy, of course, are pursuing initiatives like the Mattei Plan, but then it takes contents. And here Europe needs to invest much more. I'm a bit surprised or disappointed, if you like, by people discussing again public common debt for defense costs rather than accelerating the development of the continent closest to us. A continent that is going to play an increasingly important role in the future. This lack of vision leads to discuss how using the political capital. Professor Buti said we need to change the political discount rate. Don't just say this is a cost, in the future we will reap benefits. If you are short-sighted, this is not so attractive, of course. Civil society and businesses can do much because they have realized that transition is cost effective. They should become more vocal. as they did last Tuesday in Ivrea, when the festival was inaugurated, and they will keep doing the same next week. I end by drawing your attention to our common future, a future where cooperation, we will have cooperation and competition and choices concerning wars and conflicts. Again, even inside Europe, not all understand that we have a common destiny. Countries count very little. Yesterday, during the Day for Europe, we published a set of papers, the analysis of what happened in the last 5 years in terms of legislation, European legislation, a summary of the manifestos that were prepared by political forces, the talks on the future. The first one on the future of Europe involved Enrico Letta, and I don't forget to follow Radio Radicale, because they too air those conversations. Decisions to make will heavily depend on the future European Parliament. So please stay informed and vote. Go to vote to influence the future that we want. Thanks again. See you soon. By the way, another important meeting will be held on the 20th of May. We'll see how the new constitution has an influence on the legal fight on climate, and many more events, including later today at the Salone del Libro in Turin. Tomorrow morning, we will publish an interesting digital paper on the future, and the rest of the festival. Thanks again. Enjoy the festival.